Hey team, the channel recently crossed 20,000 subscribers, which is absolutely mental because at the start of the year, the channel was only around like 1,600. I've been hammering away at this for about 3 years now, so it's nice to actually finally start building a really strong community of people who want to improve their mental performance. And you might have seen I put a post up and sent an email out saying that we'll do a little bit of a Q&A to celebrate. An opportunity for you guys to literally ask me anything. So thanks to everyone who sent in questions. It's a mix of both, I guess, kind of personal questions, but then also still some performance-related things. So yeah, so let's jump into it. Okay, so question number 1 from Griffin. What team do you support and who is your favourite player? So I actually was born and raised in Reading. So I'm actually a Reading fan, which over the past 5 years or so has not been too fun. The club's been in turmoil, finally got relegated last season and have had points deductions, transfer embargoes, all of that. But I was fortunate to kind of grow up during our sort of heyday. I was actually a season ticket holder during the 2006 season when we won the championship with a record-breaking 106 points. I was also a season ticket holder during our first couple of seasons in the Premier League. But when I first started supporting Reading, they weren't so good. And the typical thing in primary school was actually everyone supported Reading, but also had a Premier League team. So my Premier League team was Man United. And the reason for that was at the time, a certain number 7, David Beckham. And eventually he left and was replaced by another number 7, who actually then turned out to be my favourite player ever. So Cristiano Ronaldo has to be my number 1 player ever. You can go into all the GOAT debates with the Messi stuff. But just for me as a kid, when he burst onto the scene with all those step overs, it was the most exciting player to watch. And then actually to kind of see him evolve into this absolute goal scoring machine was kind of crazy. And I think what I respect about him more than anything is just the work ethic. I wouldn't say he was naturally ever the most gifted or talented player, but he's by far the most hardworking player I think we've ever seen. And for me, as someone who always believes in the power of hard work, as opposed to just relying on talent, he's a perfect role model for that. So yeah, I would definitely have to say Ronaldo's my favourite player. Next question from Edgar. How should you act to a person who is always trying to unmotivate you when you do something wrong? So yeah, I think we all face kind of like tough people or people who are particularly tough on us in high performance environments, whether that's a coach, teacher, parents, etc. And look, it will depend on that exact relationship, but I think there are a couple of things that you can always do. And I think the first one is just actually like stay calm and composed. One of the worst things we can do is when people are getting at us is actually kind of like take the bait and sort of snap. It's kind of often what they might want. And then the other thing I think you should always do is actually reflect on their true intentions, right? So I was actually watching the Peter Crouch documentary last night on Amazon Prime. Although his father comes across as a very nice guy in the documentary, his dad wanted to be intentionally hard on him because he thought that Peter Crouch was too nice, that he wouldn't make it as a pro because he was just too much of a kind of clown, bit of a sort of jokester, wouldn't really be as physical as he could be, kind of let some of the early abuse that he got in his career because of his height sort of get to him. And then there was this one moment that particularly stood out where Crouch was about, I think, 13 years old at Tottenham, where he just completely chickened out of a tackle. And his dad went absolutely mental at him, saying like, that's just disgraceful. That's a non-negotiable. Like, you're not going to make it if you do that. And his dad actually sort of drove away from the training session and Crouch was left to actually have to make his own way home. At the time, as a kid, he was like completely shocked, was sort of crying, thinking, what the hell? He's supposed to be my dad. He's supposed to sort of always support me. But he kind of learned that, yeah, he had to be sort of tough on himself in the same way that his dad was being tough on him. So always think about the intentions. Sometimes it does come from a good place, albeit sometimes the execution is not good. It's often the case that if it's someone who actually has our best interests at heart, sometimes they will be harsh and sometimes they will use tactics that you might think are trying to put you down or not motivate you. It's a bit of kind of typical reverse psychology. So just think about that. Question number 3 from Zanyardo. What do you do for a living apart from YouTube? Okay, so I wouldn't say I've had a conventional career by any stretch of the imagination. I've actually only ever been employed by companies for no more than 6 months at a time. I'm just not either a good employee or the traditional sort of work route doesn't really work for me. So I've had to kind of carve my own pathway. And that has involved doing things like, the mental performance coaching that I work with people on a one-to-one basis. And then I actually do a fair amount of teaching as well. So I teach sociology and psychology online. And then just throughout the past few years, I also run workshops, trainings, seminars for companies on a range of topics in sort of high performance. Next up, Bryce asks, how did you get into sports psychology and making videos? So I've always been interested in the mental side of sports. Back when I was a football player, I was always sort of like testing on myself ways that I could unlock a better mental state when performing, and this was the days before you had sort of YouTube and endless sort of resources now on the internet. So it was kind of just like sort of test and learn. I'd do sort of little journaling exercises, I'd do visualization, I'd do sort of self-talk and mantras, etc. So I was always interested just how can people sort of elevate things to the next level. And then eventually I got to a point where I studied performance psychology at university for my master's. And that didn't just incorporate sport, that's basically the study of high performance in any domain. So yes, when I was studying that, I read a lot of papers on on sports and athletes, but I also read a lot into all other sort of high performance domains. So emergency services, military, education, business, just any domain that people need to perform their best under pressure. And then when it came to starting a YouTube channel, I've said in previous videos before, at the start of 2020, started my own sort of performance training company, started running workshops and talks and whatnot in London. Then the pandemic hit and I lost a lot of work pretty much overnight. So I kind of thought about how can I actually get my voice out a bit more, particularly as like training for companies was going online and remote. So I kind of started making videos, one, to build up a bit of a catalog of things I could potentially send people talking about high performance in various different sort of ways. And then also just out of sheer boredom. So pandemic, you know, for a lot of us, we're just trapped indoors, had a lot of time on our hands. It kind of always been something I was maybe interested in, you know, sort of flirted with the idea of like making videos, but I just never got round to it. So the pandemic was kind of a bit of a blessing in disguise. Next question from Phi Man Hyung. Apologies if I've mispronounced that. Have you been through any dark periods in your life? And how did you get over them? I guess a period that would really stand out was that my ambition when I was younger was actually to get a sports scholarship and go to America. So back when I was like 14, 15, I was, you know, pretty good at football. I'd played sort of county level. I'd never really got into academies or anything, but I was also quite academic. And I had a friend at the time whose brother was actually doing a soccer scholarship in America. And so when he came back for like summer holidays and stuff, we used to play football with him. And he said, look, you're really good, one, for your age in terms of football ability, but then also your academics are really good. You'd be like a perfect sort of candidate. So he was actually going to help me with my application as and when it got to the time. And that was obviously still a few years away. But when I was 16, in the summer, just after my GCSEs, I tore cartilage in my left knee. And it was a long road to recovery in the sense that I had to get an operation, but it was through the NHS here, in which the system has very long wait lists and times. So I remember like I tore cartilage in my knee in like the June and then didn't have an operation until March, and then had to do all kind of physio recovery. And at that point, I then started sixth form college, and I was going through a bit of a rough time anyway, because a few months prior as well, my parents had split up. And when you're sort of 16, you kind of know the sort of full ramifications of that. And I wouldn't say I went off the rails, but at that age, you know, sort of 16, particularly in the UK, you go to sixth form, and that's where people start, you know, sort of drinking, smoking, you know, people getting involved in drugs. Didn't do that myself. Did my fair share of drinking and whatnot. And I was just definitely more concerned with just going out, partying, you know, hooking up with girls, although I wasn't the best at that. Football sort of fell by the wayside a little bit, and I kind of lost my love and sort of passion for it. And instead, I sort of actively chose to really go hard on my education. And although I was doing all those kind of other sort of fun things, you know, as a sort of between the ages of sort of 16 to 18, kind of gave up on my football dream, and I just devoted myself entirely to my studies. And for me, at least, that was still like a good substitute, because I knew I could still do very well academically, and it was painful to put that sort of dream aside of not pursuing football anymore. But it turned out right, because I ended up getting to Cambridge, so which was a massive deal considering I was not from a family that was academic whatsoever. No one in my family had even gone to university full stop. So going to arguably one of the best universities in the world made it all worth it. Next one is from Japheth. Again, apologies if I've mispronounced that. But they ask, how can you ignore the fear of messing up in football? So I've made a couple of videos on messing up and how to get over sort of fear of mistakes and whatnot. So definitely watch those. But something I've been doing sort of recently when I do sort of like mess up kind of on anything is just ask myself the question, will this matter in a year's time? A lot of things we mess up on just in the grand scheme of life don't matter, you know, unless it's like missing a sitter in a cup final, you know, something like that. Most of the time, mistakes are just going to be forgotten, you know, the next day. If it's not really going to matter in a year's time, don't worry about it. If it is going to matter in a year's time, then you're going to ask yourself, how do I avoid making this mistake? And then engage in some sort of practical sort of steps. But I have made videos on this before, so just watch them. If you still feel you're unsure, then feel free to email me and I'll give a bit more of a thorough response on that one. Next one from Adriano. How do I detach my self-worth and personal happiness from my performances in training and or matches? Very good question. So I think there's a couple of basic things anyone can do in this situation. And I think the first one is just to actually balance your identity. So what I mean by that is just trying to avoid having your entire identity wrapped around being an athlete. So you think about someone like Kobe Bryant, whose core identity was being the best athlete he could possibly be. He actually got to a point in his life where he cared more about being a good father and husband. And the reason this is important is if your identity is wrapped around sort of one thing, then yes, when it doesn't go well and when you have problems in it, it's going to completely tank your entire sense of self. But if you've got other aspects of yourself that are important, as a student, as a friend, as a boyfriend, whatever it may be, that gives you other sort of aspects of your identity to sort of fall back on, during those sort of tougher times. And another thing is, as much as it's cliche, just focus on process rather than outcomes. The only thing at the end of the day you can control is your effort. Things like sport are just so unpredictable. There's so many things that are outside of our hands. All we can do is focus on controllables, and that's your kind of work ethic, your dedication, your discipline, all of those things. And just trust yourself that results will come. Don't beat yourself up about it. If you can leave training sessions and matches saying, I gave it my all, that's enough. Next up from Alien Med, do you prefer any specific sport more than others? What is it and why? So number one sport for me, obviously, is football. Always has been, always will be. Beautiful game. So accessible. All you need is a ball and a wall. I would do that for hours as a kid. It's just so ingrained in culture, that I've grown up in as well. But past 5-6 years as well, I've gotten super into my basketball and NBA. So my girlfriend's actually from LA, so gone to quite a few Clippers games. Why not the Lakers? Well, Lakers is about 10 times the price. You can go see the Clippers for about $12 instead of like $120. So yeah, watching basketball live is so fucking entertaining. It's amazing. Just the athleticism, the size of these guys, how big they are, but how explosive, fast and skilled they can be. So NBA, like all day long in terms of like watching it live in a arena, I think can actually be more entertaining than watching football live in person. I've been to a lot of games that have not been too enjoyable to watch, particularly being a Reading fan. So yeah, I think definitely football will always be the number one, but close second, basketball. Okay, so Matteo asks, why is winning in sports or life in general not always fair? And why can you be the hardest worker and still not get rewarded? Unfortunately, it's just life. But seriously, as much as I'm someone who really believes in you can make your own opportunities and kind of be successful anything you put your mind to, I think just generally in society we have to be a bit more appreciative of the role of luck and chance. And I think one of the best examples of this comes from the book Bounce by Matthew Syed. So he's a journalist, but he used to be Britain's number one in table tennis. He was actually born and raised in Reading, like I was, and he went to a school where there was a teacher who just so happened to be the best table tennis coach in the entire Britain. And Matthew Syed had potential at table tennis, so this teacher invited him to this kind of club that he ran. All the local kids who were good at table tennis would go to this club and receive expert coaching from the best coach in the country at this sport. And Matthew Syed realised that only when he got older that the majority of the best tennis players in the entire country came from literally one street. I think it was like 12 people, including himself, that lived on this street, that lived a stone's throw away from this little place that they would go training. And it just shows you how much chance plays a role. He was just lucky to be born in Reading, go to that school where that teacher just so happened to be the best coach in a sport. He had a little bit of a knack for it and then was nurtured. If he was born the other side of Reading, might not have happened whatsoever. So it just shows you how much like chance and luck play a role. And I think we should all be appreciative of that. And I think this is a really good example of what's called an unfair advantage. There is a book called Unfair Advantages. Can't remember who wrote it, but really good book to just go into detail of we all have certain things that give us an unfair advantage in life. And look, a lot of these things can be superficial, particularly things related to how we look. But all of us have certain traits, characteristics that set us apart from other people. And it's about trying to find environments in which we can really nurture those. And look, we see this in sport all the time. You might have heard the phrase, you don't choose the sport chooses you. So as much as I might have an ambition to be an NBA player, I'm 6 foot. I wouldn't really be able to sort of make it compared to someone who's 6'7". I happen to be a good long distance runner because I've got long limbs and I'm naturally quite slim. So you just have to be aware of like, what are your unfair advantages and how can you maximize those to kind of level out the playing field in terms of getting success. Next one from Alan. What have you learned from your YouTube channel and mentality coaching? In other words, how has this journey changed your life? Big question. We could probably do a separate video on this one, but I would say one thing more than anything else in terms of both mentality coaching and YouTube, doing YouTube, would just be about the power of consistency, right? Everything when it comes to success comes down to consistency, I'd have to say. I, at times, have not been consistent with this channel. I think in my first year on the channel, I made 52 videos in a year, so one a week. And I think I'm now 3 years into my journey. I've only made like 117 videos, 118 or something, where I should be in the 150 odds if I was to keep up that trajectory. And it's the same with kind of mentality coaching, where the people that I have worked with, and I've worked with professional athletes, the ones who have the most success comes down to consistency. And that's in terms of consistently applying the things that I tell them, not just one practice later or one game later. They make it routine, they make it habit, they consistently do it week in, week out, month in, month out, year in, year out. And, that goes for also their kind of training. That goes for their diet, that goes for keeping on top of their sleep. Everything comes down to consistency, and it's the hardest thing to achieve because we all have so many other sort of competing priorities in our life. We've got friends, family, we've got other duties, responsibilities, we've got to study alongside doing sport, or, study alongside and growing a business, whatever it may be. We all have so many things competing for our time, attention, and energy. So remaining consistent is the hardest thing, but it's the thing. That is above everything else I've ever said on this YouTube channel. The one thing that's going to make you a success or not. It comes down to consistency. There's no hack, trick, strategy other than that that's going to have more of an impact on the trajectory of your success. Next up, Daniel asked, do you have any tips on how to play freely, less tense during important points in a match? And his sport is tennis. So I would say more than anything, irrespective of the sport, is to develop routines, right? So obviously in tennis, that might be bouncing the ball a certain amount of times. It could be hitting your racket on your shoe. You've seen football penalty takers have a penalty sort of routine. Again, going back to tennis, you've also got people like Rafa Nadal doing a sort of water bottle thing, in between sets, etc. So the reason those routines work is because it gives you a greater sense of control. And that's what it really comes down to during high pressure moments. You want to feel like you're in control, and you start to tense up and not feel so free when you feel that sense of control going. So if you have a routine that you just kind of lock into, you go into autopilot, and you feel a lot more calm, you feel a lot more relaxed, and in turn that's going to help you play a lot more freely. Last few, Reese asked, which athlete do you think is the greatest mindset? We could do a whole video on this, which we might have to, but just off the top of my head, I would say Eliud Kipchoge. And the reason for this is because the guy's done something that people thought was physically impossible when he ran a sub 2 hour marathon in 2019. Now, of course, it wasn't official in the sense that, he had the paces, he had the kind of laser on the car, it was kind of this event. That doesn't take away from the fact that he used his 2 legs and covered 26.2 miles in less than 2 hours, which, if you've ever seen any of those videos, he's basically fucking sprinting for 2 hours. It's absolutely insane. And the fact of the matter is, anyone will tell you who's done a marathon, from mile 20 onwards, everything just sort of like starts eroding, just starts sort of collapsing, retaining your sort of form, your running economy, all these different things just collapse. But him, for those last 6 miles or whatever, yes, he had the paces in front of him and whatnot, and, was sort of shielding him from the wind and all those sorts of things. He was just chilling. He was chilling. And he had more energy when he was going across the line. Anyone who has done sort of intense endurance exercise knows that that is the mentally toughest thing to do. So yeah, I think probably a lot of people would disagree with me, but I just think because of how calm, composed he is, during the toughest moments, it has to be him, because I know from experience how tough long distance running is. Next up, Bong and Cozy. Again, apologies if I've mispronounced that. How do you stop yourself from quitting something that you don't really feel like but will be beneficial to you in the long run when you feel like you're mentally, physically, and emotionally fatigued at the moment? Really good questions, because a lot of us will overwork, and in order to achieve what you want to achieve, that is the reality. I hate it when people who are super successful and they've already reached the top, they say, oh, you just need to slow down, you just need to sort of chill out, work's not everything. It is when you're climbing, it is when you're chasing your dreams, you're trying to reach the top of whatever it is that you're pursuing. And during those tough moments where you are working really hard and you lose that motivation, it's one of the most difficult things, without question. But what's really helped me in the past when I'm sort of grinding away and the motivation's low and you're kind of like exhausted, etc., it's just to have some form of like visual reminder or tracker or checker of what you're actually working towards. So for me, back in 2019, my big overarching goal was to buy a property, which is obviously a big goal for anyone. But for me in particular, this was super important because I had seen my parents live pretty much their entire lives in rented accommodation. So, they didn't really have a sort of stable, permanent sort of place that they could call their own. And, we moved around a little bit as I got a little bit older because, we were just in rented accommodation. You don't have those kind of rights to sort of stay. The landlord can just decide to sort of sell or raise the rent massively. And, I saw that it caused a lot of sort of friction, a lot of sort of difficulty at times in my parents' relationship. So for me, I always wanted that sort of sense of security. And for me, owning a property would achieve that. Now, the problem is it's fucking expensive. And the second problem is that I was self-employed. And being self-employed, you have to have an even bigger deposit than regular sort of salary earners because you're seen as more of a risk. So instead of the usual 5 or 10% deposits that people in salary jobs would have to put down, as a self-employed person, I needed like 25% deposit. And that 25% for me was a big number. And I wasn't someone who had the luxury of any inheritance or financial contribution from parents. I was going to have to do this off my own back. And so I had the kind of like clear sort of target of this number. And what I would do is every week calculate how much I'd earn and then how much of that would be able to go to the deposit. And there was a period in 2019 where I did this and I ended up working 76 days in a row without a break, which do I regret? No, because it got me to my goal. And literally the end of every week, I calculated how much I'd earn, obviously set aside the money for taxes and living costs, how much could I actually sort of save of that money to put towards my deposit. And it really accelerated my progress towards the goal. Even though I was exhausted mentally, physically, emotionally at times, it was for a greater good. And it was worth doing in that sort of short term. Managed to get that, managed to buy a really nice sort of 2-bedroom flat in Edinburgh. One of the best decisions of my life, for sure, without question. So I think definitely having some form of like visual tracker, checker, to have checkpoints is massive, because otherwise you're just sort of grinding the axe day after day with no sort of end goal in mind. So final question from Maria, what are your biggest goals right now? So there's a few different ones. Biggest sort of performance personal goal at the minute of mine is to run my first marathon. Some of you may know that in May I was meant to do this, but unfortunately I got an injury a couple of weeks before. Meant I had to drop out sort of 10 miles into the Edinburgh Marathon. So instead I'm going to be doing the York Marathon in October, which I'm kind of shitting it at the minute. So I actually have been on holiday for the past 5.5 weeks. I've not really done too much running, and I've only got 12 weeks to get fit and do this marathon. So that's going to be a really interesting goal to pursue. I've got a few other kind of goals related to the YouTube channel in terms of like subscriber amount that I want to reach, even though that's not the most important metric. It's still something that validates you to a certain extent. I'm aware of that. So we want to maybe reach a certain number. I'll keep that secret. Why don't you guys put in the comments below how many subscribers you think the channel can get to by the end of the year. And then I've also got a few other sort of work-related goals of building some things that hopefully are going to help a lot of you guys out with your own performance journeys. So stay tuned. So that's a wrap on those questions. Once again, thank you so much for being part of this journey so far. It's been a wild 6 months of just the growth that this channel has seen. Keep up your comments as well. That is one of the biggest things that has been driving me to keep pumping out videos, because I'm seeing the impact and the benefit that it's causing. So if you have a story of how videos have helped you, leave a comment, send me an email. It genuinely does fuel me, keeps me going. So thanks again to everyone who's consumed my content. Hope we continue to grow together on this journey, and I'll see you in the next one.